Start. And now it's all yours, Kirsten. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am, even though it is 7:30 in the morning, I am so delighted to be here in this space with Rotarians who I have just come to appreciate so much for everything that you do to forge human connections in our communities and around the world. Oops, I forgot to turn my and I want to start by saying that I am the mother of a kid who was chosen to be a Rotary Exchange ambassador in the fall of 2019, and of course the pandemic in 2020 derailed his plans to go abroad. But in the lead up, before we knew that, I had the chance to talk to a lot of or to be involved in his preparation, and I met a lot of Rotarians, and I was just really taken by the mission of the Rotary. So, but before I was a mom, I was a native Minnesotan who left home at 18, and like a lot of young people, resolved to never come back, never move back to my home state. But 2 decades later, I did return after training to be an academic historian. So, it was that return home, it was that coming back that galvanized me to use my skills to understand some of the harder aspects of the past in Minneapolis, which is my hometown. So in 2016, that led me to come together with a small group of activist researchers who had diverse skills and interests to start what is now known as Mapping Prejudice. And we did this at the University of Minnesota Libraries. And our team resolved to do something, and it's good that we didn't know that no one had ever done it before. And that was to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants or racially restrictive deeds for an American city. So we wanted to use the tools of public history and digital mapping to explore one question, which is, how did Minnesota develop some of the largest racial disparities in the country? So of course, in recent years, there's been a lot of media attention to racial disparities in Minnesota. And our project has been focused on one manifestation of this, one number, which is significant for all kinds of reasons. And that is the racial gap in our homeownership rates. So the Twin Cities specifically has the highest gap in the country for any metropolitan area between Black and white homeownership rates. And this is notable in part because the Minnesota and the Twin Cities in general are also very prosperous. Like this is a thriving area economically. But in the Twin Cities, 75% of white families own their own homes, while only 23% of Black families can say the same thing. And housing it's so foundational. It sits at the foundation of everything else. If you think about it, think about what kind of housing you have determines whether you can keep your family from getting sick, what kind of exposure you have to different things, what kind of access to education you're going to have, whether or not your family will be able to amass any kind of wealth, and whether you'll be able to pass that wealth on to the next generation. So lots of people had been talking about these disparities, but I came at it from a slightly different perspective because I was trained as a historian. I wanted to use the past to understand how we got to this place. And in looking at the past, I became focused on this critical turning point for Minnesota, and that was to use a certain kind of private contract to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So of course, these private contracts are called racial covenants. And what they were clauses that were inserted into property deeds. And they were sometimes written on the official maps that were registered with county recorders that said, where the property lines were. Those are called plat maps. And what this language did is it kept people who were not white from buying or occupying any, the pieces of land that they were attached to. So There's lots of people were involved in making these covenants and making them popular, spreading them. Realtors, city planners, bankers, elected officials, just ordinary people, neighborhood activists, and they were enforced for more than 100 years. And they weren't the only thing that worked to keep land in the hands of white people. They worked in concert with other things like violence, real estate steering, and of course, discriminatory lending practices, redlining. So this is the earliest covenant that we found in Minnesota, and it was put in place in South Minneapolis in 1910, and that's it documents a transaction between Henry and Leonora Scott, who sold a piece of property on 35th Avenue South to a Swedish immigrant. His name was Nels Anderson. He was a baker, and his house was not very, impressive. It was a small, modest house that had a chicken coop out back, but it had this racial restriction, the stipulation that it said the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And you might wonder, about that language, and that language is really early 20th century, reflects early 20th century ideas about race. Mongolian was a term that was often used to refer to Native Americans. So we're not totally sure about the Moors. I mean, this is another piece of the research that we're developing. But we do know who wrote this particular clause. His name was Edmund Walton. And he was one of the biggest real estate developers at the time in Minnesota. And he inserted this very, very same language into thousands of other deeds in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And a lot of people, once he did this, a lot of people followed his lead all across Minnesota. And they composed dozens of variations on this language that had the same intent. So I'm going to read you a couple of examples, but I just want to forewarn people that it's disturbing. So here's another example of covenant that we found. No person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And I should stop and say too, this covenant was put in place in 1946. So after the conclusion of World War II, after the United States had gone to fight fascism and Hitler. So that's one of the extraordinary things about that particular document to me. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. I mean, that's sort of a admission that we don't know actually who's white, that it's contested. It's not obvious. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by a domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. So I've been reading these words for many years now, with Mapping Prejudice, doing these presentations for Mapping Prejudice, and I have to say they still they make the hair on my arm stand up. I mean, they provoke a physical response. These are brutal words, but I read them. I think it's really important for us to read them and hear them, because I feel like it's my mission as a historian to acknowledge that this happened, and this is the first step. If we're going to move forward together, we need to confront that this racism, that it was intentional, and acknowledge the impact that it had. But that's my experience, and that's not a universal reaction to these words. And for people who have had firsthand experience with the consequences of these kinds of restrictions, I hope that this acknowledgement will be empowering and not painful. So racial covenants and all these other, this constellation of other practices were made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And once that happened, there was a real rush to forget, at least among white people. And what our project is doing is we're trying to pull back what we have come to see as this willful amnesia and be in spaces like this to engage in collective remembering. We're also creating data sets, and we hope that they're helpful. I mean, we're trying very deliberately to put them in the hands of people, community change makers. And I think the Just Deeds group is a great example of community change makers who are using this data. But there's some people who are hearing this for the first time, and they're shocked, right? And I'm very sympathetic to that reaction. But I think it's really important for me to underscore that there was nothing secret about these covenants when they were in use. So racial covenants were printed in newspaper ads for new housing developments. They were on the front page of newspapers regularly. They were in books. They were in, they were talked about in plays and in poems. And of course, they were passed, stories about covenants were passed down, were part of the lives of Black, Asian, Jewish, and Native American families. But even with all that, even with this incredibly rich record of memoirs and narratives and stories and activism, there's still a lot. When we started mapping prejudice, there's a lot that we didn't know about racial covenants. For instance, what did covenants actually say? What was the text of covenants? Where were they used? How common were they? What neighborhoods were they in? How much land did they cover? And we decided to answer those questions in a unconventional way. No one had ever done this before. We took digitized property records from Hennepin County and used computers to flag documents that seemed to have racist language. And then we harnessed the power of community. So we put the property records that were flagged by the computer in a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And this allowed us to invite the community in, to invite volunteers from all kinds of backgrounds into the work. And for Hennepin County, for our Hennepin County map, we were incredibly fortunate to have 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds. And they found 24,000 property parcels that have racial covenants. And then we expanded our geographic focus to St. Paul, and we had an additional 3,000 volunteers who joined us for this effort. And they read 250,000 deed images. So when we put all of that information, all that work of our volunteers on a map, this is what we got. So this is our newly updated as of this summer after we added the Ramsey County data in. And what you're seeing a time lapse of the spread of racial covenants through Hennepin County and Ramsey County over time. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the years ticking by and the number of covenants increasing. And each one of these blue dots denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. And when we get, right at this moment, this is the full map. You can see all the land in those two counties that was reserved in this way, that was covered, identified as having racial covenants. And I think it's important to understand too, by the time it was illegal to put new covenants in the 1950s in Minnesota, a lot of that land was actually not developed for residential use. So in the areas where there was actually residential development, there's a tremendous density of these covenants. So again, no one had ever done this for an American city. And I want to emphasize that we're not done mapping covenants. We're still working on the Twin Cities. We're still adding more data to Ramsey County. And we recently got property records from Dakota, Anoka, and Washington counties. And we're working on getting them ready for volunteers to read too. And we're also, right now, we're working with a new project group in Milwaukee. We're mapping racial covenants in Milwaukee. And of course, we're not the only people doing this. In Rochester, where it's sort of near where all of you are, you have a tremendous group of people who don't have access to digitized records, and they're doing this work by hand. It's very extremely painstaking. And I think maybe of you, and I'm going to let the Just Deeds folks talk more in depth about, they know this work they're the experts in this work. But this is a map of the covenants that they have mapped so far that they've found. So I want to be clear that this is not just an urban phenomenon. We love to map. We think it's really important. We'd like to map all the covenants all over the state. We've been told people send us their deeds. We know that there are covenants in every county across the state, but no one has ever done a systematic search for restrictions on rural property records. And we think this would be a really rich avenue for inquiry and really reveal a lot. And it's also important to know, I mean, if you haven't already gotten the message, covenants were everywhere. So this is not just a Minnesota thing. They were used in every region, probably every community. And because they were pushed out through national institutions, namely the National Association of Realtors and the federal government. The federal government actually made them a condition of favorable lending practices or rates in the 1930s. So that at that point, racial covenants went to every community across the country. But that's why we're working with researchers across the country to develop our tools and to figure out how to do this work in a way that really has an impact that's meaningful for people. So just to review, I read you text of the covenants and to illuminate that they were explicitly racist. The map shows you how widespread they were. We know they were everywhere. There's no community that doesn't have these restrictions. But it's also important for you to understand how powerful they were. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that once they were in place, they were embedded into deeds. It didn't matter how many times the land changed hands or what was built there, the racial restriction stayed with the land. And anyone who dared to breach a covenant, even decades after it was put into place, risked losing that land, losing any money, any equity they had accumulated in that property. And the way covenants worked is if you breached a covenant, the land went back to the person who put the covenant in the first place. So in the case of Edmund Walton, who put his covenants in the early 20th century, he died around World War I, but it would have gone to his daughters. So people always ask me about resistance to these covenants, and I think it's really important to be clear that they were very hard to defy. But the other thing to realize is that we have polling data from the 20th century that shows that covenants had overwhelming support among white Minnesotans. We have opinion surveys from the 1940s that show that the majority of Minnesotans believed that they were beneficial. So Black people, by contrast, had a very different opinion. They saw covenants as a basic threat to liberty, to civil rights. And we here in Minnesota, we had leaders like Nellie Francis and Madison Jackson and Lena Olive Smith and James Wardlaw and Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. They challenged the premise and the practice of restricting housing just for white people. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. That's what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a tiny white bungalow in South Minneapolis, right at the beginning of the Great Depression. When neighbors found out that a Black family was moving in, they organized to stop the sale. So they called the city, they called the realtor, they called the bank, they called other neighbors, they called the police department. The Lees ignored all this pressure and threats, and they moved into the house. And that summer, in July of 1931, after they moved in, they found themselves under siege. Thousands of people gathered around their house every night to try to frighten them into moving out. They threw paint at the house. They shot through the windows. They threatened to burn the house down. And the picture on the left here shows Edith and her daughter Mary, who was just about to start kindergarten in 1931, in front of the house after one of these attacks. You can see the black paint on the siding behind them, and you can also see the broken window in the upper right-hand corner. The Lee House is still standing today. And in fact, it's on the National Register of Historic Places. And if you visit Minneapolis, you can see there's a memorial, there's a monument out front to this. The house is still standing because the family had the support of the NAACP locally. They had the support of Arthur's co-workers at the post office. And he was a World War I veteran. Other veterans also rallied to form an armed perimeter around this house to keep the house from being burned down and keep the family safe. It's the Lee family didn't, the Lee house didn't have a covenant on it. It was just one or two blocks, but it was 1 or 2 blocks out of sort of the prescribed area for Black people in Minneapolis, on the south side of Minneapolis, and into what was seen as a white neighborhood. But it was the proliferation of these covenants in the years leading up to when they moved in that normalized the ideas that led to this attack. So covenants hardened racial boundaries in cities, and along with that, there was this ever-present threat of white violence, and it's important to understand this was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. It wasn't. People did not bother going to court. They called together a mob. And so, I mean, that's just a really important thing to understand. So of course, covenants are illegal today, and this is thanks to the legal campaign of the NAACP that resulted in a Supreme Court decision starting with Shelley v. Kramer, and laws ending with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And for many years, I would say that historians ended the story of covenants at that point in 1968, and told something of a triumphant narrative that covenants were a terrible practice, but American values prevailed, our institutions bent the arc of history towards justice, end of story. Alas, the reason why I'm here today and the reason why we're having this conversation is there's more. This is not just in the past. And here's the central question of our project. So covenants have been illegal for 50 years. So why do we care? Why do we need to know about any of this, any of these stories I'm telling you? And the reason is that we're still living with the legacies of these practices. So I'm going to offer you some insights that we've developed from Minneapolis, where our research has been going out for the longest, where our data set is most developed. But in talking to our colleagues around the country, we're part of a research consortium. These are patterns that people are seeing everywhere. So what did covenants do? They transformed what was a pretty racially integrated city into a really segregated city. So part of that was just restricting where people could live. Part of it was changing norms, and covenants really emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass Black residents like the Lees. And as a result of this, Black residents were really pushed into a couple of small neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And as new neighborhoods were developed, they were restricted with covenants. And those neighborhoods are still the whitest in Minneapolis today. It's astonishing. It was astonishing to us when we first developed the first data set of covenants to overlay it on contemporary demographics and find that the demographic patterns have just not budged. And of course, the neighborhoods that didn't have covenants were redlined. That's the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous investments for lenders. And this really had the effect of choking off capital to those neighborhoods. So it's these two things together, especially covenants and redlining, that made it really hard for people who are not white to buy homes. It made it really hard, in fact, for people who are not white to find any kind of stable, affordable, and decent housing. So I started by talking about how I'm a native Minneapolitan, how I left Minnesota and came back, and of course this history is really personal for me in so many ways. I'm a third generation Minneapolitan, And at the same time that residents in South Minneapolis were terrorizing the Lees and other Black families, they were welcoming my grandparents to the city. So my grandparents came from immigrant families with roots in Sweden, and they really overcame so many odds. So two of my grandparents were orphaned at young ages. They had certainly no capital to start, no money, no financial help to start their lives, and very little education. None of my grandparents made it past middle school. And once they got out of school, they worked as farmhands and domestic servants and lumberjacks and carpenters. And they actually moved all over the upper Midwest. They lived in Wisconsin and Montana and North Dakota. And then in the 20s and 30s, they all converged on Minneapolis to try their luck in the big city. And they found a lot of opportunity. They were sort of protagonists in the classic American narrative. And during the Great Depression, they built businesses, they got married, they saved their money. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses, and in the same neighborhood, in fact, at South Minneapolis. And this is a film that my grandfather had made one of my grandfathers had made to celebrate this occasion, because it was such a big deal in my family. And just to be, totally, I love pointing this out, the little guy right in the middle of the screen in the overalls on the shoulders, that's my dad. That my grandfather, I used to call this a home movie until someone explained to me that the technology, there was no home movie. So he actually hired a film crew. And we have this film. It goes on for hours, 3 hours of footage that shows that they invited everyone they had ever known, who came in their best clothes, pulled up in their newly washed cars, and to celebrate. So thanks to our work, though, I know now that this house had a covenant. So that black icon on the map there, that's my grandparents' house. And the red that you see is all covenants. So although my grandparents were new arrivals to this country, they were regarded as white. And that was very significant. We found actually that homes with covenants were actually marketed specifically to people like my grandparents, to immigrants like my grandparents. This is an ad for a development in Como Park in St. Paul from a Swedish newspaper, and it prints the text of the covenant in Swedish and assures buyers that the developer, Thomas Frankson, who would go on to become the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, would enforce covenants to the fullest extent of the law. So the fact that my grandparents were seen as white meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had similar incomes and similar levels of education. So I grew up visiting my grandparents and listening to stories about what it was like to grow up in this neighborhood near Lake Nokomis. My parents and my uncles talked about just what a great place it was to be a kid in the 40s and the 50s, that they had so much green space. They could roam around the lake. It was safe. There were so many kids. And really importantly, the neighborhood had solid schools, and both of my parents ended up going to college. My mom went to graduate school, even though their parents had not made it past middle school. So what no one ever talked about with me, no one ever mentioned, was that this was only for white people. And my parents say that they never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German. And this uniform whiteness to them seemed totally natural. And even though I know now, looking back as a historian, that the city was changing demographically pretty dramatically in these same years, that there was an influx of Black residents. Another thing that's important about the timing is that my grandparents bought their homes just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. And much of this new prosperity rested on this new access to home ownership, which had been really deliberately supported by the federal government in the 1930s. And these federal programs spurred the creation of the modern mortgage, which the 20 or the 30-year mortgage, which allowed many, many more people to become homeowners. Unfortunately, these same programs also promoted redlining. So these programs are really built on around a tenet of white supremacy, which meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So again, why does this matter? This is in the past, right? But 2 generations later, I am still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged, they were assisted to buy homes in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. And what our research shows today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, is that houses in Minneapolis that had covenants, like the one owned by my grandparents, are today worth 15% more than identical houses that never had covenants. And why this is significant to me is that my grandparents were able to pass that additional value on to me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and distributed the profits to the grandchildren. Each one of us got some piece of the equity in the house, and that's what I used to put a down payment on the house that I'm in today in South Minneapolis. And when I was looking for this house, I basically was looking to replicate all the things that my parents talked about as being really important to them as kids. Solid schools, easy access to green space in Minneapolis. And I know that I'm extremely fortunate, but realtors will tell you that, and I bet there's some realtors in this group, that I'm not exceptional in this regard. They've done research that has found that 30% of first-time home buyers get help from family to manage the purchase of a home. So like many of my peers, I leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. But because I'm a historian, my kids will tell you that they've come of age hearing constantly how their lives have been shaped by the opportunities that were enjoyed by my grandparents. So we talk all the time about how as a family, we carry our history with us. So what are we trying to do with our maps? Our map is trying to help everyone understand that we carry our history with us, where we're located in this history. And our volunteers have taught us so much. They've taught us that reading these documents, reading these deeds helps them to see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. So we're trying to help people understand that racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just really blatantly racist people who, express their sentiments openly, like these protesters who picketed the Minnesota state hearings on fair housing in 1962. So we want people to understand that racist ideology has been embedded in community institutions over decades, that it's been written into our foundational documents of our communities. And it's up to us to see that text where, in all these documents. And I think this history helps us to understand why it's frequently the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity today. So what do we do now that we know this? How do we change course? So the first step, you've done the first step, which is to remember, that's what we're doing today. That's the first step of the process of repair or reparations, what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. But it's too much to live with just being aware and not taking action. We need to change material conditions too. And I really do believe that we're standing at a moment of opportunity. And we've seen these shifts at other points in our history. I talked about the New Deal. The federal government decided to support homeownership in 1930. Only 30% of Americans owned their own homes. By 1960, 60% of Americans were homeowners. We have tremendous ability with collective will to do things. And that shift that I'm talking about fueled the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. It fueled the enormous prosperity that made the United States the envy of the world. I believe that we can make those kinds of shifts again. But my question to you is, what role are you going to play? So at Mapping Prejudice, in my work with Mapping Prejudice, I'm using the tools that I've developed as a historian to make change. I'm here to tell the truth about who we are as a community and what we've done. And I'm here with all of you because that's how I generate the hope that I need to move forward. So I ask you, what tools do you have? You know, where can you put them to work? I'm handing the baton to you, so to speak. How do we make meaningful change? Look around the institutions and the organizations where you have influence. What needs to happen? And how can we help? How can Mapping Prejudice help you? What resources can we provide to all of you who are working for change? So I want to talk about some of the groups that I look to for guidance. One is the Equity in Place group in Minneapolis. I think it's always important. This is a coalition of organizations that are led by people of color, people who have been affected by racial covenants. And I always think it's important to ask the people most affected by the problem for the solutions. Mapping Prejudice is also a founding member of the Just Deeds Coalition. This is a coalition of stakeholders who have pledged to work together to identify and dismantle structural racism in spheres where we have influence. So some action points, like what are the groups in your community that are thinking about ways to dismantle the harm done by these policies? What are their priorities for change? So these are the questions that we need to ask if we want to repair the damage. So with that, I would love to open it up. Oh, here's some more ideas. I'd love to open it. I can leave the slide up for thought if people want, and I'd love to open it up to questions. And also, I'd love to hear from our Just Deeds representatives who are here too from Rochester.
Thanks, Kirsten. So this is Jun Nguyen. I am the Deputy City Attorney down here in Rochester. I am here with Dave Doppelhammer. We've been working on the Just Deeds. First off, if there are any questions, I don't want to overstep, and I'll wait before I jump into kind of what we're doing down here in Rochester. So hearing none.
Okay.
I had the lovely pleasure of meeting Kirsten last year when we were at a Just Deeds barbecue. I was kind of roped into this by happenstance a little bit with the previous city attorney. So Rochester is the first non-metropolitan city that joined the Just Deeds movement. And this happened on March 22nd, 2021. The City Council passed Resolution 51-21 approving participations in the Just Deeds project. And from there, that's where I got roped in. What we've been able to do, we don't have as many of the resources as the Metro has. We don't have Mapping Prejudice down here yet. I'm still hoping to get Kirsten down here and get her connected with Phil Wheeler, because we kind of started our meetings with Phil Wheeler and his work at the NAACP. He has a group of volunteers that's, like Kirsten said, painstakingly, slowly go through all of the deeds. They're going it by phases. I believe we're on phase 3. There are 4 to 5 phases. And so what I would just submit is that if anyone is looking to have, that hands-on impact, looking through those deeds, please reach out. We'll get you in touch with Phil so that you can help with the mapping portion of discriminatory covenants here in Rochester and in our surrounding areas. I know he's been looking at Orinoco, Byron, and those kind of areas. I know for a little bit they were really honing in on the Mayo area. I don't know if anyone heard NPR, but they did run a segment on that. As far as our Just Deeds work here in the city, what we've been able to do, and Dave, please jump in at any point. We have a page on the rochestermn.gov website. Homeowners are able to submit applications for us to review their deeds and let them know whether or not there is a restrictive covenant. If so, we can work with you, go through the paperwork so that we can have those discharged. Alternatively, there is also a volunteer button. That's how you can get a hold of us, and we can connect you with Phil to help with this movement. There's still a lot of work to do. There's a lot of education that we believe that can help, educate the community. We love coming to these kind of events and meetings, and to have that space to chat. A lot of people ask, well, does this erase the discriminative covenant? And it doesn't. And as Kirsten said, one of the most important things is to acknowledge and remember that this has happened, and in some aspects continue to happen in just very invisible ways. And we can talk about that later. It's not that it's erased, it's that we're denouncing that covenant. To sit there and say that this is not right, it is illegal and it's unenforceable, but it's a symbolic movement that helps start that conversation. I know that within the city, we have our diversity, equity, and inclusion director that we work closely with. We work with community development. We would like to take this information and use it for our zoning, for our community development. Where is it? Where's the need? What are the services that are needed in our community? Where are those disparities that we can try to close the gap on? I know that we have ran a complete list of city-owned properties, and we will start working on making sure that we discharge any covenants that of properties that the city owns. So I've been rambling a bit, but do we have any, that's kind of our spiel here.
There
Hi,
is
can
one
I add-
question. Yeah.
I wanted to add just a comment. So most people probably don't know who Phil Wheeler is, but Phil, that's kind of the resident that's taking the lead on this, was a former city county planner. So he is well steeped in the history of Rochester. He's done a lot of work on political redistricting as well. So just so you know, there is someone helping who is quite knowledgeable about the area.
And what is wonderful is from that list that was on there, the other cities that are also in Just Deed. So it looks like it's expanding around Minnesota. So that's a really good idea. There was a question, is there a plan to digitize the deeds in Olmsted County?
I am not sure. That would be a county question, unless, Dave, are you aware when speaking with the recorders?
I'm not aware if there is the plan or the resources to do that down here yet.
Okay. Are there any other questions? It is a most impressive presentation. It has certainly given a lot to think about and to be aware of. I forgot to introduce the other members of our diversity, equity, and inclusion team. In the 3 Rochester Rotary clubs work very collaboratively, and this is one of the teams that we work together. Stacy, why don't you wave your hand? Stacy is the past president of the Thursday Club, the Rotary Club of Rochester. And Paul, or where are you? Paul Bassler is the current president of the Tuesday Club, the Rotary, the Risers. So I wanted to be sure to introduce them as a host of this particular program. Well, if there are no more questions, Kirsten, thank you so much. You have given really so much to think about. Is it the truth? Is it beneficial to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And is it fair to all concerned? Those are the statements that we have to take with us and live it as an act. So thank you all very much for being here. And I hope that you're leaving with as many thoughts as I am of what we can do next. So thank you.